I think one more minute as we tick over one more minute, and then I'll get us going. All right, I think it might be time to get things going. My name is Stacy VanDeveer, and I am a professor in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance in the Policy School at UMass Boston. This panel is called Innovations in Conceptualizing and Undertaking Environmental Peacebuilding. We have 4 presenters today. Laura Peters from University College London, Alec Crawford from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or IISD, Leonisa Ardizzone, I should have asked how to pronounce that correctly, so she should tell me how I've done it wrong. She's at Vassar College, and Elsa Barron from the University of Notre Dame. We'll start in that order. Let me say that Joe will put our anti-harassment policy reminder in the chat. He has done so. Thank you, Joe. Just as a reminder that we have expectations of norms and good treatment. The policy is there. And importantly, when you click through to the policy, if at any time you experience something that you believe is inappropriate, there is, when you click through, there are people, conference organizers to whom to write, and those notes are confidential. So just to let you know that that resource and that is available as a reminder to everyone of our appropriate behavior and respect. So let's see. I have asked the presenters to stick to around about 11 minutes each. I'll maybe launch a couple of questions just to get conversation going after the 4th proposal. And then we will invite you to put questions in the chat. Participants, audience folks who've logged in, you are very welcome to actually, drop a question into the chat along the way, and we will return to it. So if you have a question that occurs to you during one of the first 2 or 3 presentations, by all means, put it in the chat, and we'll try to make sure that we do some moderating of the chat when we get there. Participants, you're muted for now until all of the are done. And then when we get there, I'll either read questions from the chat, or you can use the hand raising function if you want to ask it yourself. And Joe will help me moderate that. That works best if there aren't too many questions. If there get to be a lot of questions, then please do put them in the chat. That way we can keep them grouped and keep our presenters going and get lots of discussion. So our first presenter, who to start us off, is Laura Peters of Beyond Disaster Vulnerabilities. And take us away, Laura, and thank you very much for all of our audience members. We're up over 41, which sounds delightful.
Thanks so much, Stacy. Let me share my screen here. All right, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. All right. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for joining my presentation today and for joining this session. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be a part of this community. I'll be presenting my research today on disaster risk creation and reduction in conflict-affected contexts. So the co-occurrence of disasters and conflicts is neither new nor extraordinary. contemporary history has produced many examples of disasters occurring in fragile and conflict-affected regions around the world. We might think of post-conflict Nepal, suffering through the Gorkha earthquake in 2015 and its aftermath, for example, or places like Afghanistan and South Sudan that have faced turbulent histories of complex violent conflicts and recurring disasters. When considering potential relationships, researchers and policymakers most often ask how the occurrence of a disaster might instigate, lengthen, or intensify violent conflict. And then on the flip side, there's a subset of literature on disaster diplomacy, which asks if disasters might open up opportunities for cooperation and even broader peace building. What much of this literature has in common is in conceptualizing disasters as exogenous events that happen to and shock societies, and then assessing the consequences on conflict and peace. But disasters do not come out of nowhere, and they are not inevitable. Disasters are socially constructed by human actions and inactions. It is the interactions between natural hazards and human choices that turn hazard events into disasters. And from this perspective, disasters are not natural. Disasters can better be understood as long-term social and political processes that unfold over time within a society rather than events that happen to societies. So following this logic, conflict affects how, where, and when disasters occur. For the approximately 1 billion people who live in active conflict zones around the world, they can already tell you that they disproportionately bear disaster losses and suffering. But despite this, the field of disaster risk reduction does not often acknowledge the political causes of disaster risks and sees conflict as a context to navigate rather than a disaster driver to be addressed. And this is a huge and unacceptable blind spot for a field that is tasked with systematically identifying, assessing, and reducing disaster risks. And this is the entry point for my research. So I conducted in-depth, semi-structured interviews with 32 DRR experts with experience designing, implementing, and evaluating DRR programming in 25 conflict-affected countries across Africa, Western Asia, and Southern Asia. I conducted a data-driven thematic analysis of my interview data and validated the findings by sharing with the research participants a draft paper with the synthesized results and then soliciting their feedback and reflections in an iterative effort to co-create knowledge. So previous research has described that conflicts generally contribute to disaster vulnerabilities, but my results suggest that this presents an overly simplified understanding of how conflicts contribute to disaster risk creation. In fact, my results suggest that conflicts have the potential to influence all parts of the disaster risk pseudo-equation, including hazards, increasing exposure, increasing or magnifying vulnerabilities, and decreasing coping capacities. There is also limited evidence from the interview data that conflict can, in certain roundabout ways, increase coping capacities in some contexts. And so what was interesting here is that these multiple channels of hazards, exposures, vulnerabilities, and coping capacities, they interact at multiple institutional and temporal scales. And so let's take flooding, for example. At an individual scale, environmentally destructive solutions can be the only ones available or immediately apparent in conflict emergency settings when public services cease. And then at the community level, communities may destroy natural resources like forests and the flood prevention benefits that they bring through collective conflict or survival strategies at scale. Weakened or corrupt national governments may have inadequate infrastructural investments and policies. So one participant shared that heavy rain, quote, heavy rain can sometimes lead to disasters, such as flash floods, particularly when water channels are damaged or not well maintained due to conflict and are consequently blocked. This means that the disaster occurred not as a result of the rain, but rather as a result of poor infrastructure stemming from conflict, end quote. And then at the international level, humanitarian relief missions may distribute plastic water bottles and food in plastic bags to people who then may discard them in waterways and block water flow. And the main thing that I want to convey through this example and what my research showed is that conflicts overdetermine disasters and disaster risks. And so there's not a single pathway with a single solution when we're dealing with multiple channels interacting at multiple scales. And so DRR programming needs to start thinking about conflict as much more than a context to be navigated, and even beyond a do no harm or conflict sensitivity mindset, if we really want to begin making inroads into intervening in the ever-tightening relationships between conflicts and disasters. So my research has peered into the complexity of disaster-conflict relationships to understand how disasters and DRR may then also influence conflict risks or peace potential. For example, DRR and post-disaster aid in conflict settings is often distributed along social political cleavages rather than reducing vulnerabilities or responding to needs equitably. One participant described, quote, "We have weak institutions, but strong individuals who mislead people or cause people to hate or harm each other or cause pandemonium in the society using their influence and power," end quote. And this influence can also spill over into shaping mindsets over time. And for example, in a discussion of whether youth groups have engaged in DRR, a participant shared that youth are taught to shoot guns at a very young age. And so, quote, "DRR would be the last thing they would have on their minds. They have a stick for cows on the one hand and an AK-47 on the other," end quote. And so people in such contexts are conditioned not to see alternatives to violence, as well as alternatives to disasters. However, disasters and DRR can also influence peace potential. I want to share with you a powerful story that one of my participants told me. The participant described a DRR project to build improved shelters in 2 neighboring villages that had a recent history of violent conflict. And the conflict culminated in the militia of one village beheading the chief of the other village. And so when the DRR program arrived in the villages to implement the shelter project, they quickly realized that there was a lot of festering grievances between the 2 villages, and that bringing in new DRR resources would have the potential to reignite conflict. And so the team began this project by facilitating a dialogue between the chief of the one village and the new chief of the other village to plan how they might actually work together to implement the shelter project. And in doing so, they also had the opportunity to work through some of their conflict-related grievances. And they decided at the end of this to have a beautiful forgiveness ceremony and feast with the 2 villages together to sort of kick off the rest of the project. And the participant recalled, quote, "This strategy had an effect or impact we actually didn't anticipate, which is that we saw the villagers on both sides of the village beginning to work together to build shelters for each other," end quote. So you would have people who burned down and destroyed the houses during the conflict of the one village, then turning this page and beginning to work together to help each other rebuild their houses in safer and improved ways. And then the second thing that happened is momentum. The community members continued the project after it formally concluded to ensure that everyone received the benefits across both of these villages. And the participant remarked, quote, "We had essentially 100% more shelters built than we had planned for. So we doubled the results with just the resources that we had planned for." end quote. An integrated approach to DRR and peacebuilding, as was demonstrated here, built new capacities for a shared and ultimately safer future together. So this research expands potential entry points and strategies for when, how, and where we can act to break the disaster conflict risk cycle. And it's published in a paper last year in 2021 in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, and a forthcoming accepted paper in the Journal of Peacebuilding and Development. So we don't need to wait for disasters to happen to begin acting upon them. And through disaster prevention activities, we can also build peace. Thank you very much again, and this concludes my presentation.
Thank you. Laura, that was perfect. You are literally a model citizen at exactly 11 minutes. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Alec, but Laura, I'll encourage you to plunk both of those citations in the chat. So if people capture the chat later, they capture those if they want. And that's true for the other panelists or anyone else. If some citation occurs to you, then by all means, toss it in there for our collective benefit. Alec Crawford, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Stacy, and thanks so much for including me in the panel. It's great to be beside the other panelists this afternoon and listening to what they're saying. So my name is Alec Crawford. I work for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is a Canadian think tank. I've been working in the environmental peacebuilding space for nearly 20 years now, focusing on a few different areas, but the area that I'd like to speak with you about today focuses on adaptation planning and peacebuilding in particular. Within ISD, we were kind of in the early days when it came to climate change and security, we were really focused on making the case that there was a link between the two. I think that case has largely been made by now. I don't have to convince any of you on the call. But in more recent years, what we've tried to do is focus at the policy and practice level on figuring out ways to both make peacebuilding more climate resilient and also climate change programming in fragile states more conflict sensitive or conflict responsive. So that's what I'd like to focus on today. I'll just quickly go through the next few slides because again, I don't think that this is news to anyone. Trying to go through my slides here, but I can't. Hang on a second. There you go. So in context of fragility, again, no surprise here, it can be very difficult to prioritize climate adaptation action. If you're a state that's struggling to prevent, mitigate, or recover from conflict and fragility, that road to stability is going to be fraught with challenges. You've got immediate needs that you have to address, whether it's ensuring security, relieving suffering, delivering public services. And for governments, particularly fragile governments, getting these priorities delivered can be difficult at the best of times, but doing so when you're recovering from a conflict or when you're in a conflict with limited resources, weakened capacities, and under the threat of violence is, of course, exponentially harder. That said, we think that, and we try to argue that it would be a mistake to neglect medium and long-term adaptation needs. We also think that oftentimes conflict and climate risks share the same drivers, not exclusively, but there is certainly a very strong overlap there. And those drivers and vulnerabilities can be mutually reinforcing. And as a result, adapting to the impacts of climate change can help address these challenges. Again, I want to be fully cognizant of the fact that making that argument in a fragile state can be difficult because there's a lot of urgent priorities that need to be addressed. Again, not a big surprise to anyone on the call, I don't think, but there's a significant overlap between fragile states and the states that are most vulnerable to climate change and least prepared to adapt. On the one side here of this table, you see states from the Fragile States Index, and on the other, it's from the ND Gain Index on climate vulnerability. As you can see, 8 of the 12 states are on both of those lists. So huge overlap there and a huge amount of work that needs to be done. But as I mentioned, it can be very difficult to prioritize investments in climate adaptation in fragile states. There's the question of prioritization, which I mentioned already. So how do you invest time and money in immediate needs over longer term or medium term risks and uncertainties that are associated with climate change? Adaptation projects, of course, can themselves be derailed by conflict. There's often a lack of data and information. Weather stations have been destroyed. Human resources have either fled or been killed. In Afghanistan, for example, after the initial takeover by the Taliban, they dismissed the entire meteorological agency. So that capacity to build policies and plans on a foundation of strong data and information can often be missing. And then, of course, financing, it's not going to come as a big surprise, can dry up in a fragile state. It's either not there to begin with, or it just dries up, both domestic financing coming out of the national budget and then international financing that might be coming into the country. So the end result of all that is, of course, that those most vulnerable to climate change, namely those living in contexts of fragility and exposed to climate risks, are frequently among the least able to adapt to its impacts. So where do we come into this from an ISD perspective? At the moment, one of the things that we're looking at is what's called the National Adaptation Plan process. Some of you may be familiar with the NAP process. Within ISD, we've been, since 2014, running something called the NAP Global Network, which is a network aimed at supporting developing countries in the development of their national adaptation plans. The national adaptation plans, for those of you who are unaware of what these are, is essentially exactly what it sounds like. It's an attempt by developing countries to develop a plan for their adaptation priorities that is looking at the medium and long term. It's not just their immediate adaptation priorities, but it's looking a bit further down the line. And it's very much, how do you integrate climate adaptation into your development processes? So trying to make them not a standalone plan of the government, but really integrating them into national development processes. It's an iterative process, so we're not looking at just a plan, a document that's going to maybe, just gather dust on someone's shelf, but rather it's an iterative process that is based around planning to implementation to monitoring and evaluation and back to planning. And it's going to be ongoing as countries both develop these and then roll them out and then adjust them based on the lessons that they're learning. So as I mentioned, ISD has been kind of focusing quite a bit in this space and in supporting developing countries in developing these plans. And what we've seen is that increasingly states that are struggling with fragility or struggling with stability challenges are now kind of catching up to other countries when it comes to the actual launching of these plans and kind of trying to get them off the ground. And what we're trying to do now is help these states really align these national adaptation plans with their peacebuilding plans. So if you're, for example, Somalia, you have a peacebuilding plan in place, you also are starting off a process of developing a national adaptation plan that's really going to lay out your adaptation priorities, your funding priorities, et cetera, and integrate those into your development plan. How do you also take your peacebuilding plan and make sure that your NAP is aligned with that, so that, again, you can address those shared drivers of vulnerability and hopefully use adaptation as a means of addressing some of those priorities. The NAP process, I should say, is extremely, or it's designed to be a country-driven and country-owned process. So this isn't outsiders coming into a country and saying, these are your adaptation priorities, but rather it's the governments themselves coming up with the priorities and ensuring that the plan is designed for the local context. And our role, as well as the role of other partners, is to support them in that, but not guide the process. At the same time, that sounds a lot like a peacebuilding process. It's something that has to be country-driven and country-owned. So we see that there is quite a bit of overlap between these two processes, and that's why it makes sense to try to align them as much as possible. The timelines intersect. We're talking about medium and long-term interventions. So we're not talking about peacemaking and peacekeeping. We're talking about what are we going to do in 5 to 10 years when it comes to both our peacebuilding priorities and our climate priorities, and how do we align those things. It takes a very holistic approach to addressing vulnerability, which, as I mentioned, can also serve to address some of the vulnerabilities or risks associated with climate, because oftentimes there's overlap there. The NAP process itself, as with environmental peacebuilding, is very much built on a platform of dialogue for diverse stakeholders. So it's a very participative, very inclusive process, or at least it's meant to be designed as such. And that's very much in line with peacebuilding. And then kind of getting to the funding question, the NAP process itself has considerable political and financial momentum behind it at the moment. And there may be opportunities for fragile states that are struggling with resources, struggling with government capacities, to tap into things like the Green Climate Fund, the GEF, to start to address not only those deficiencies, but also, tackle their climate risks and their conflict risks at the same time. We've looked at NAPs in practice, and this is just kind of a snapshot of some of the NAPs that have been developed and some of the ways in which governments are starting to think about climate or conflict when it comes to their adaptation priorities. As you can see, there's quite a few governments that are thinking about it as adaptation as a means to prevent conflict. So we recognize that, if we don't do something about, for example, in Cameroon, in their NAP document, they say if we don't do something about land management issues, there's very much a potential that climate change will lead to increased tensions and potentially conflicts between pastoralists and farmers. The same comes out if you look at Colombia's NAP around water issues. They see it as, water cooperation as a potential means of preventing conflict. And they're aligning their NAP process with, again, those conflict prevention and peace building goals. Some countries view it both as a means of preventing conflict, but also acknowledge that conflict can be a source of climate vulnerability, and that insecurity within the country is going to make adapting to climate change much more difficult. So Burkina Faso is a good example, Sudan, South Sudan. In South Sudan, for example, they just released their NAP document, their National Adaptation Plan document. And in that document, it says, we have a data and information deficiency when it comes to climate change. And until we address that challenge, we're not going to be able to adapt, and conflict will continue to be a source of climate vulnerability. We need to kind of integrate that as a key priority for our NAP process. So interesting ways that governments are approaching this. So what are we doing, just as a bit of kind of selfless promotion? As I mentioned, the NAP Global Network is increasingly looking and working with fragile states and conflict-affected and high-risk areas at developing these national adaptation plans. So we've done, some recent work with Somalia, for example, with Chad, with Central African Republic. And this is, again, working with and supporting government staff in developing these plans and attempting to align them with their peace building or conflict prevention objectives. At the same time, we're developing guidance at the moment on how you can design either conflict responsive or conflict sensitive NAPs. I'm calling it conflict responsive NAPs because that seems to be more kind of peace positive than conflict sensitive. It's not just doing no harm, but it's actively designing an adaptation process at the national level that actively goes for these kind of root causes of both conflict risk and climate risk. There are, of course, quite a few ongoing challenges that we're struggling with, and I know that my time's almost up, Stacy, so maybe I'll cede the floor, but transboundary risks are going to be an issue because these are national plans, they're not transboundary plans. So aligning between neighboring countries is going to be crucial. How do you do adaptation in active conflicts? That's something that we're, of course, continuing to struggle with. And then how do you ensure the full participation of marginalized populations is always going to be a challenge. But again, the NAP process, like peace building processes, are designed to be as inclusive and participative as possible. So you have to keep struggling towards that. Happy to kind of take more questions on that, both in the chat and in the Q&A at the end of the session. But thanks for giving me a few minutes to introduce our work.
Thank you, Alec. That is great. Thank you very much. Two wonderful presentations. Next up is Leonisa, whose last name I'm certain I mispronounced. So please correct it and introduce yourself and take us away. Alec's gonna take down his slide, I think. There we go.
Thank you. Share mine. Hello, sorry. Yes, so I am Leonisa Ardizzone. You were very close, so, right, okay. And I am so grateful to be here today and share some of this work I've been doing with addressing climate change through peace education. A little quick background that will come out and be clearer as we go along is that my background is as a scientist, and then I became a science educator for 30 years. And I am currently also an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. So I'm a member of the clergy. So all these ideas fit together through that lens, but I have been a peace educator most of that time. So that's where I land. I wanted to throw this quote up here because it was something that was pretty impactful when I first read it many years ago. And it's from Gus Speth, and I'll summarize, you can read it too, but I share it because it's a call to the reality that we may do all these things through technology and action and science, but there are root causes to some of these environmental issues that have nothing to do with technology, and they have everything to do with us changing our hearts and consciousness and the way we do that. And so that's what led me a number of years ago to my three-legged stool for the work that I use, right? So it's science, spirituality, and peace education. Many of us are probably aware that there's been a science, spirituality, or science and religion argument for centuries, and it's old and it should be over. And I think it is in many ways, but I also think in climate change, we really have this wonderful opportunity to bring science and spirituality into dialogue on how we're going to address this issue, because we have to use our heads and our hearts in this. And then peace education for me is a mode and way of being that I think will allow for that kind of dialogue and practice. So I teach, as we mentioned, at Vassar College, which is a small liberal arts university for undergrads only in New York State. And I get to teach a course that I've designed called Science, Spirituality, and Peace Education, Addressing Climate Change. I've been here for 4 years, and I have actually a couple of colleagues in peace education on the faculty, which is kind of nice. But importantly, our entire department is dedicated to using our education courses as a way of looking at structural violence and structural oppression, to promoting understanding of human rights and how we use education as a liberatory pedagogy. So this course is open to anyone in the college. We get a lot of education majors because they might want to go do something in the world, but we also get religion majors, media, international studies, and the like, because the topic is really relevant to these young, 18 to 23-year-olds that I'm working with. So the question is, for those of you who are here and not heard of peace education, what is peace education? Peace education has a pretty long history, even though it's not implemented that much. And it historically, thanks to my previous colleagues, makes it easy for me to talk about peace education as stemming out of peace research and addressing war and destruction and conflict and disarmament. Those were some of the original causes. And over time, it has evolved to address more and ever expanding methods of thinking of how we can create a positive and lasting peace. So it's democracy, education falls under there, conflict resolution, sustainability, human rights, and et cetera there. So in my work, I find that it's really helpful for me to frame everything, and whether I'm doing this through my ministry or in education, with these 3 core values of peace education. They were put forth by my mentor and one of the founding mothers of peace education, Dr. Betty Reardon, and these were written in a book she released in the 80s. So planetary stewardship, I mean, they all seem pretty obvious, but I'll take a moment. That is caring for all creation and recognizing our role as stewards, caregivers, not just users, exploiters, extractors. Humane relationship is how we can think about relating to one another to promote dialogue and collaboration. And I love some of the examples we've already heard, ways we see and hear one another and can enter into a dialogue or a joint effort to address issues. And then global citizenship is really, I think, important, because while conflicts and things may happen at borders or within boundaries, climate change is a global phenomenon, right? It affects all the earth, and we also know that those who feel it the most are often those who are the least like to be putting the most carbon dioxide into the environment, right? So we know there's this uneven this imbalance of who's creating this. So if we see ourselves as global citizens, citizens of the cosmos, as it were, then that can help us move towards working together for solutions. Oops, sorry, trouble advancing. Okay, so my to frame the course, we talk about 3 big ideas. We spend, more than a few hours talking about violence, root causes of violence, the manifestations of violence, and how it actually shows up in direct harm to the earth and creation. We spend time defining peace, right? Not just the absence of war and conflict, but refilling that cup of peace with all the things that we know would make the world more just and equitable and environmentally safe. And then I use a peace pedagogy. And some of this is really transformative. It's unpacking assumptions, looking at root causes, making sure that what we're discussing and addressing is contextual and learner-centered. It's critical and analytical, deeply founded in Paulo Freire's work. It's also futures-oriented. We spend time doing activities of what is the world we want to see, and then how do we get there? So we do visioning and we do action thinking and planning. And I thought I would just put this slide up for a minute. So the past 2 times I've taught the course, we were on the Zoom because it was a pandemic. And so luckily I got to save a Jamboard of what some of my students came up with, was how they were thinking about peace education based on some core readings. There's a few favorites in here for me. I like the one that we have to learn peace for the first time. Teaching humanity and shifting our collective consciousness. And then peace education puts an emphasis on action as well as practice. Since violence stems from insecurity, we must address fears. And then emphasizing reverence, which is right there in the middle, in all aspects of life. So I wanted to share because I know that there are a handful of universities currently offering courses on, more than a handful now, on climate change. There are less that are doing it with a science and spirituality connection. So I just wanted to lay out how I actually do that. One is we start with a peace education. We make sure we understand what we mean by peace education, peace pedagogy, what our efforts are. We spend a fair amount of time digging into the science of climate change. So I don't make the assumption that my students actually get it. I may have environmental studies majors in there, but I also may have literature majors, right? And so unfortunately, after spending years as a science teacher in the public education system in the United States, I know we don't always do a very good job of teaching science or climate change at all. So we spend time digging into it, how it shows up, how we can connect to it, how we reconnect with nature, how we think about it. And then we move into pretty much the whole second half of the class is looking at religious and interspiritual resources and responses and core texts and tenets of how we reconnect with the earth. And then a fun thing I do in the class, which is sort of something you don't actually see in university classes, is we have spiritual practices. We start every class with a spiritual practice of some kind to engage that aspect of ourselves in this journey. The highlight of the course for me as the professor is that using peace pedagogy, they don't write a final paper, they come up with an action project. So I've seen things, students have made documentary films, podcasts, they organize a campus-wide concert with opportunities for action tabling. They've had art show at our local gallery. I've had a few children's book manuscripts, K through 12 curricula. A couple of students have created outdoor poetry and meditation sessions where we walked through the preserves and wrote poems. And then there are some who have just done wonderful research themselves as undergrads. So the outcomes, though, I ask for feedback on the end every year to see how I can change it or where we go. And I thought I'd throw some of the positive things in here. Some of the students like that it balances the emotional side of the climate crisis, what they're feeling and their worries and fears, and brings it to a strategy. Now what, right? They feel empowered. They like that it's spiritual. One student definitely said it was her spiritual awakening in her relationship to the environment. They like generating real life solutions. They open their hearts and minds. They want to do mindfulness practice, and using religion in a framework for many of them felt really compelling and not something that they'd experienced before. I wanted to share on this second to last slide here some of the smiling faces of these young people that actually give me hope in the world. And these are them. I don't think I asked them if it was okay, but I think they won't mind. But look at them. These are the ones. This is where it's happening. And so I wanted to close with this very strange little slide. My research assistant was like, "You said that." And I said, "Yes, I do say this." So I do workshops for clergy as well as educators. And I came up with a tagline that I wanted to share with all of you because I thought it might provoke some discussion. But I often say, science provides us with the evidence. Our faith compels us to act. And so I hope that we can talk about that. And some of you will get in touch if you want to continue this conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. And again, let me ask that audience folks can put questions and comments in the chat as we go along, and presenters can pop resources in the chat if they want things to be captured as we go forward. And so now our fourth and final presenter is Elsa Barron from the University of Notre Dame, Faith Engagement in Environmental Peacebuilding.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Leonisa, for that presentation that really well tees up what I'm going to talk about. So this is a perfect flow, which what I am going to talk about is faith's engagement in environmental peacebuilding. And so I want to start with kind of like a broad overview and conceptualization of this idea that recognizes that faith engagement in environmental peacebuilding, as stated as such, isn't present in a lot of literature, but the legacy of action on environmental, for environmental defenders, for those who are demanding action on climate change, and also for peace builders, and the intersection of those issues with peace, there is a long legacy of that action. So this is very much not a new subject, even though some of the language around it might be new to this space. And I also think that these two images demonstrate that legacy really well, because on the right side, there's a coalition of faith organizations who are marching this November at COP26 to demand climate justice, to demand care for our neighbors, action on climate change. And on the left side, there's a protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline here in the United States with a sign that says "Defend the Sacred." And this is an Indigenous-led movement. And I think that oftentimes when we speak about faith communities, we don't recognize the strong tradition of Indigenous spiritualities also in that faith presence, and the connection and relationship between these groups in a legacy of peace building and defense of the environment. And of course, there's also stickier subjects of colonization and oppression as well that need to be addressed. But in terms of values, there can be a lot of resonance in this space. So to get to those values, a lot of this conversation is based on a white paper that was developed by a group of authors from different organizations and different universities. So very grateful to their engagement on this subject, as well as a series of events that were a part of the Road to Geneva on faith-based approaches to environmental peacebuilding. And out of that collection of thought and event and conversation and writing, 3 principles really engaged for faith engagement with environmental peacebuilding that show, not only the ways in which faith actors are already doing this work, but significant contributions that they can add to the field of environmental peacebuilding. And these are: first, relationship to environment and community; second, dialogue and collaboration; and third, healing through justice and reconciliation, which is kind of the ultimate goal of this work. And I'll dive a little bit deeper into each of those subjects, the first of which being relationship. And relationship, which was already discussed a little bit in the framework of spirituality, is really about shifting values. And Pope Francis's encyclical from 2015, Laudato Si, or On Care for Our Common Home in English, really revolutionized this conversation about relationship, at least in the sphere of Christian and monotheistic spaces, with the refrain that everything is interconnected and calling for a framework of integral ecology, which really just brought these ideas that have been in long conversation over decades and centuries to the forefront of the conversation, that we are in a relationship with the environment, that there's great interconnectedness, and we're experiencing that interconnectedness with the ways that the environment impacts humans and in the ways in which we impact the environment and climate change, etc. This image is from Tent of Nations, which is a farm run by a Palestinian Christian family in the West Bank. And this is the entrance to their farm, which says, "We refuse to be enemies." And that stands for their neighbors, and it stands for the environment. And so when challenges of structural and physical violence have come across this farm, they have responded under this framework of relationship and of refusing to be enemies. So when electricity was cut off for security reasons, they responded by adapting with solar power. When water was cut off for security reasons, they started collecting rainwater. And when the roads were blocked, they decided to try to become as self-sufficient as possible on their land so that they wouldn't need to venture out against the blocked roads. And they continue to invite people into their space to learn about their relationship with the land, to learn about their tradition of nonviolence and creativity that is based and rooted in environmental stewardship. And I think that that's just such a great case study of the importance of relationship to this conversation. And then, of course, it's impossible not to mention and draw on the significance of Indigenous communities and spiritualities who have maintained traditions of relationship to the environment over many generations and often in the face of fierce opposition. And I think it's important to acknowledge that colonialism in this sense is a form of structural violence that in many ways has sought to disconnect the relationship between people and the environment and commodify the environment for use, which is a different kind of relationship that is in many ways counterproductive to the traditions of relationships that have been developed in a spiritual sense. The second area of interest or of foundation here is dialogue. And there's extensive scholarship and practice of effective interfaith dialogue in the peace studies tradition. And many people have written about effective methodologies and approaches and implications for conflicts, especially in areas where conflicts can center or include religion as part of that conversation. And so there's a lot to say about dialogue. But when you apply dialogue to the environment, it's a very interesting case study because there's an amazing degree and sense of consensus on the sacredness of the earth and the people who inhabit it. And that's not to say that there aren't significant differences between traditions and how they perceive the environment, but overall, in terms of a broad framework, there's a really strong consensus here. And this image is from a group of diverse faith leaders who are gathering in Indianapolis to ask the legislator to care for our common home, as is written on the slide, and to respond to environmental degradation and climate change. And they're giving this call together as part of a group called Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light. And the broader Interfaith Power and Light network in the United States is a great example of how dialogue translates to action and advocacy, where local communities gather together and are able to organize and dialogue across faith traditions and then come up with a shared degree of consensus and requests for action in their communities. And I think that this is so important to highlight because the United States isn't often thought of as a case study of peace building, but I think that there's so much need and so much opportunity to do that. And this is a great example of interfaith dialogue that I think is a form of community level peace building that is trying to combat the harms to the environment. In the Road to Geneva series, we had 3 sessions, and the final session was seeking to actually apply some of the conversations we had had, and to do so through an actual practice of dialogue. And so in order to do that, we split into groups to read a set of creation stories, including narratives drawing from Native American, Judeo-Christian, Hindu, and Muslim traditions. And there were a lot of really great observations and analysis that came from those discussions and from those active practices of reading and dialogue. And there were critical differences between accounts and their associated worldview, but there was also a very shared understanding and importance of relationship. So in Sky Woman Falling, a Native American creation account told by Robin Wall Kimmerer, it highlighted a world lacking hierarchy and inspired by mutual sacrifice and interconnectedness. Similarly, participants noted that the Hindu account of Viraj implies that humans and non-humans came out of the same process, creating a sense of equality. And in contrast to that, Judeo-Christian accounts and Muslim accounts framed the relationship between humanity and the environment and God in a slightly different framework that was more human-centric. Yet it was still one that implied a strong responsibility on behalf of humanity to steward and protect the world that they had been provided. So that was just kind of the outcome of our practice of dialogue in recognizing the significance of difference, but also shared values and a shared desire for the outcome of relationship with the environment and each other. And finally, what would be the desired outcome from these processes is healing and reconciliation. And if you frame the issue of climate change and environmental degradation broadly as a form of structural violence that is disconnecting the relationship between people and the world around them, then reconciliation really is desired and it is needed. And then if you think more specifically about the way that the environment informs conflict and conflict informs the environment, there's of course reconciliation needed in that framework as well. This image is from Wangari Maathai's Greenbelt movement. She was the first African woman to win a Nobel Prize for her work. And in her book, The Greenbelt Movement, she explains the importance of cultural and spiritual values because they link people with their roots, God, and the environment. And this was necessary because the systems and values of indigenous Kenyans were eroded, trivialized, and deliberately destroyed in the process of colonization. And so she perceives her movement of tree planting, of women's empowerment, and of connecting with the environment as a way to counter the violence of colonialism and reconcile with the land, reconcile with each other, and to reestablish a sense of peace. And so another example of this could be, there are numerous examples of this, but in our futurism session, it was really great to actually imagine what reconciliation might look like by asking questions like, in a decolonized future world, our relationships would be blank, and opening it up to discussion. Or in a sustainable future world, our stewardship of resources might look like blank. And just seeing what people had to say from the perspective of different faith traditions and backgrounds. So in conclusion, I think the real significance here of faith-based approaches and a value add to the environmental peacebuilding conversation is really in taking a values-based approach and acknowledging that relationship, dialogue, and reconciliation are very important principles that can be brought into the environmental peacebuilding conversation, both at a localized case study level and also at a broad level when we conceptualize the root of the climate crisis, as Leonisa so eloquently stated, or quoted someone else who stated, is in that idea of greed, of selfishness, and a disconnection from the world around us. So that is where I'll end it today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Elsa. And first of all, I want to say that you are all 4 model citizens of timeliness. So I don't know how many years it's been since I was on a panel with at least 4 people and everybody was on time, but this was glorious. So thank you very much. And all such interesting discussions and presentations. So first, let me remind audience folks again, put some questions in the chat. I would love, I want to get our speakers talking just very briefly, a little brief answers from each of you as some of our audience members get in about, tell us all a little bit about how you'd like to push the research and the work you're doing forward, say over the next, so do you have, empirical cases you're doing, particular focus that you're doing, what for you is the place to go next with this work? And just very brief answers, and then I'll start moderating the questions in the chat after you give us a sense. Why don't we go, Laura and Alec, you get us started briefly since that was the order we started in.
Sure, I can jump in. So, overall, well, first I wanted to say thank you so much to the other panelists for your presentations. They were incredibly thought-provoking and just absolutely wonderful, just really enriching. As far as my future research, my current and future research, I'm engaged in doing some deeper case studies within, various countries, various contexts, subnational contexts, of trying to understand really how disaster and conflict risks combine in a variety of ways, including through conflict-induced or disaster-induced internal displacement, for example, and how that plays into these processes of disaster and conflict risk creation. Some of the other work that I'm involved in, we're just kicking off this year a project funded by the U.S. Institute of Peace on environmental peacebuilding in Palestine, Jordan, and Israel, as well as Bosnia and Herzegovina, with wonderful partners at American University, Oregon State University, and EcoPeace Middle East. And for this project, I'm so excited about it. We're really trying to drive further into relationships of how countries can begin countries and communities can begin starting to work together to address issues over transboundary water. So these are working on a variety of different projects. This is just a little bit of a snapshot. I'll kick it over to Alec.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, for us, it's going to be continuing to support fragile states as they develop these plans, and then, as I mentioned in the chat, crucially that transition from planning to implementation. So, how can we continue to support governments as they try to identify what their adaptation priorities are? How do they then attach concrete concept notes and project proposals to those priorities and turn those into funding proposals, and advocate for and hope that the big climate financing mechanisms really start to deliver for fragile states. It's a bit of a gap at the moment, but is the Green Climate Fund going to be providing the kinds of resources that these states need to deliver on their priorities? We'll see. Also within the Now Global Network, we also try as much as possible to support and promote peer learning between fragile states. So, moving forward, can we bring together disparate government officials that are working on adaptation planning in these kinds of difficult contexts to share and discuss their approaches? And hopefully there's some cross-fertilization there where they could say, we're really struggling with this, but this is an interesting way that we found to get around it. And maybe those lessons can be used by another country to similarly get around barriers. So continued engagement with fragile state governments and really trying to support them as they move forward with their adaptation needs.
Great. Leonisa.
So I am embarking on some research on adolescent and post-adolescent spirituality and its relationship to responses to, changing democracies and climate change, just looking at activism and related to that. That's work I did years ago and I'm returning to it, but really having a spirituality lens to it. As we know that at least in the US for now, there is a decline in religious belonging, but there is a rise in a sense of spirituality. And so I'm looking to dig into that. And I'm very much an application person. So I'm expanding my work with clergy because I'm involved with, green faith and the Unitarian Universalist work. But I have an upcoming workshop for clergy on how to bring more kind of, actual knowledge and understanding of climate change into dialogue with scripture, like Elsa referred to, and then because we know that people listen to their ministers, right? Or so they say in Pew Research, right? That people, listen to their preachers. So I like the idea of working with and expanding those dialogues with clergy members, interfaith clergy members, who can serve as inspiration or thought points for people to try and gather together, either through a congregation or across congregations, to do some of this work. And to that end, I'm forming the Peace Education Center of the Hudson Valley. It's a little dream of mine, sort of where I live, to make a location where these peace education and these dialogues can happen. So it's not tied to a university or a school, but like a place that's an interfaith, intergenerational learning space. We'll see how that goes. So.
Fantastic, so interesting. Elsa, go.
Yeah, so in many ways, my research and analysis is actually headed more in the direction of Laura and Alec at the Center for Climate and Security, thinking about the ways that climate impacts and fragility and global security risks really overlap. And so that's kind of like one area of research. But in terms of connection to this project and this effort that's been ongoing over the past 2 years or so, Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light, which is an organization I've been involved in at a very local level, continues to work to connect clergy members to conversations and resources and opportunities for engagement with the climate and environmental conversation and for dialogue with each other. And so that is an ongoing practice that's very applied and localized, although everything is also so virtual in this space. So there's opportunities to connect more and more people. Another project I'm working on is a podcast called Olive Shoot, which is really trying to expand and translate conversations in environmental peace building into other areas, kind of broadening what peace building can apply to, and also making it resonate with, in particular, a new generation of leaders and a generation that is looking at the climate crisis with a real sense of grief and loss and anxiety, and providing avenues for thinking differently, finding hope, while also acknowledging the real risks and violence and challenges that are ahead. So that's kind of a project where I've been able to engage with a number of people from a diversity of sectors with a lot of different thoughts, including faith, including security, including peace, and kind of bring that together into a platform for conversation.
So interesting. Thank you so much. Alec, I think there's a question in the chat just at the end there for you about this question of working on action planning and capacity building programs in contexts where violence and institutional collapse is so very recent and so very real.
Yeah, I don't know if I can. I mean, this is a question that many smarter people than me struggle with every day. But you know, when we're discussing NAPs, the hope is that something like an adaptation plan is typically, you know, developed and implemented, not necessarily at the ministerial level, but rather, you know, it's the government bureaucrats that are going out and trying to implement this thing or moving it forward. So in Burkina Faso, for example, a country that I don't have direct experience in with their NAP, but we have supported them institutionally. You have a situation where, you know, a coup has happened, the minister has been kind of shifted out of the government, but at the same time, thankfully, a permanent secretary is still there. The environment ministry maybe is kind of flying under the radar a little bit of a new government that's trying to form, whether it's, you know, going to be somehow democratically elected or if it will continue to be a military government. You, as a result of the kind of lack of turnover within the bureaucratic side of government, you hope that that continuity can continue to do the very difficult business of planning and implementing an adaptation agenda. You never know, though. You know, may a change of regime might derail the whole thing. And this is something that we've struggled with across the board for decades on climate change programming, on peace building programming, whatever the case may be. It's extremely difficult to find a way to make these so sustainable that they can survive those kinds of regime changes. With the NAPs, again, you hope that as a participative process, it's a political process, but it's also a bureaucratic process, that you can design it in such a way that, as you mentioned, you know, you can get CSOs involved in it. You can get grassroots organizations and local authorities and local communities involved in it eventually. And as such, the ability for all these different actors to be working towards the same goal isn't disrupted by a change at the top. But that's all you can hope for, I think.
That's really great. And I will also say a very different context that, you know, for those of us who are old enough to have poured labor into climate change planning in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and for the U.S. federal government and other things, you know, whether or not it will have any impact and whether or not anyone will do anything after you pour this energy into it is a perpetual question that is not one confined to the Burkina Fasos of the world. Let's put it that way.
Exactly, but you can't not do it. Like we have to keep doing it. So yeah, you know, regardless of what happens, if there's a regime change in Somalia in 2 years, that doesn't mean we're going to stop trying to move this forward.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Laura, I had a question for you. I wanted to know, in the folks you interviewed, because they were in the sort of disaster and response space, I wondered, were they really receptive generally to your interests in these connections and the sort of your avenue in for talking about climate change, or did you experience being a kind of outsider, bringing something to them that they had not really been thinking about or grappling with? I wondered how that experience happened.
Thanks for asking that question. Yeah, I think that overall, so one of the goals of my research was really to look beyond, you know, academic literature that's trying to understand these linkages, you know, from like theoretical standpoint or even empirically by looking at databases of conflict, databases of disaster, and then, you know, trying to reconstruct these linkages and the mechanisms and pathways that connect them. And I think that very often the people who are right at the you know, ground level, who are working on these interactions, which include DRR professionals and experts, their voices aren't really heard in these spaces, in academic spaces, and then even in policy spaces. At this point, it's still a little touch and go to what extent the DRR policy community actually discusses conflict, because it's seen as, you know, just, you know, people don't necessarily want to encroach on other spaces, or, you know, don't see that as within their sphere of work. And then if you're working with countries, talking about conflict becomes a little sticky. It becomes a little difficult, as, you know, many of us know. So one of the challenges that they face is that a lot of them are seeing these things playing out in the context that they're working, and they are addressing these things, some of them through rather sophisticated integrated programming that integrates DRR and peace building, and, you know, really sees this as necessary. Sometimes they're doing it, you know, calling it different names, or, you know, doing it sometimes a little bit under the radar, just so that they don't, you know, ruffle anyone's feathers in particularly delicate situations. But, you know, one of the big problems is that there's not a space for people who are working on these things already to really expand their own vocabulary, to share their own perspectives of how things are working. And so one of the goals of my research was really to elevate their voices and to try to bring those into the conversation. So it's a very long way of answering your question, in that, you know, all of them had, you know, differing perspectives on different things, but they were definitely overlapping in their interest in the topic and their passion for actually trying to make these connections. So it was really, really inspiring, actually.
That's a really interesting answer. I think one of the things that really catches my ear for some of the things that I've been working on is that this is one of those professional spaces where, in some respects, the ways in which things need to be depoliticized to work, like conflict, like if I'm working on disaster response or humanitarian aid, there are several of these where I need to not get, I feel the pressure to not get drawn into these things which are perceived to be politicizing what I'm trying to do. And I think that was really interesting about talking about how their voices aren't heard, and also they're cautious about this very interesting stuff.
Definitely attention there.
Leonisa and Elsa, well, first, a story of many years ago, I was on a UU road show around New Hampshire with a very innovative and wonderful woman who was then at the UU congregation in Durham, where the University of New Hampshire is. But you know, not too many years ago, it seemed like a lot of, this does not include our indigenous brothers and sisters, but a lot of larger organized religion were kind of late to the party on climate activism in some respects. And one of the things that I wonder if you'd comment on is that I feel like as the climate justice and the impacts of racial, economic, and economic inequity and those connections to justice, I feel like it's really opened the space for, it's a space in which religious people and religious organizations are in a way much more comfortable and have a set of values that really works there. And I wonder if you think that the kind of justice debates have really pushed open doors for these discussions within and between religions around the climate side of the piece.
Do you want to go first, Elsa? Go ahead if you want.
Sure, I'll jump in. We both unmuted at the same time. Yeah, I think that it does, the greater acknowledgement and conversation around environmental justice, and I would add environmental peacebuilding to that too, because I think justice and peacebuilding are very, very interconnected and overlap to a great degree. It really does open doors to have different kinds of conversations. And I, in particular, have had experience with the faith tradition I grew up in is evangelical Christianity here in the United States, which is very much, it has not been attuned to conversations about climate or environment, and to a certain degree, justice as well. But being able to draw in connections between the realities of what many communities are experiencing with climate change and violence and health impacts and injustice, bringing those into the conversation does allow to, it allows to start some cracks in the walls that have been created around political boundaries and around the role of faith in society, and can kind of start to challenge those boundaries a little bit. And it's slow going and it's a challenging process. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, and there's a lot of heart for change if you're able to reach a set of core values or a foundation that can bridge some of those gaps.
Good. Thank you so much. Leonisa.
Can I add? I just want to add a little something to that. Because I do see, I mean, perfectly said, Elsa. And I think that a lot of times, or what I've seen being a person who joined many religions, I've been a seeker, and then I finally found my home, as it were. So as a person who's dabbled in quite a bit, what I often see, and I see this even in Unitarian Universalism, and it's shifting there as well, but lots of times, like, the things we care about are sort of siloed. Like, we can do this, right? And it often shows up in forms of charity, like charitable giving, or things we can do for a community. So it's not about systemic changing or systemic shifts and these things. And so I think the movement towards this more intersectional understanding that structural violence manifests in so many ways, and people who are impacted by direct violence because of their structurally violent situations, as well as environmental factors, right? Like that when those came together, I saw a lot of I'm seeing a lot of religious communities shifting into this space where there is an overlap here. This is about a common sense of injustice that needs to be addressed. And I do think some of the challenge was that science religion piece, that I think we are no longer at the point where we can make climate change about, oh, the scientists, or oh, we don't know it, right? We're well past that point. And so I think the justice movement made it a little more, I hate to say palatable, but that's sort of the word, or created a more easy pathway to get involved in then environmental justice, which then expanded to the notion of, you know, we have to be addressing climate change with these or separate from, but I think the integrated action makes the most sense, actually.
Thank you very much. There is a question in the chat about Pablo about if people want to put some favorites of books or articles about environmental justice to recommend, or environmental peacebuilding and justice. One of my personal favorites is by David Pellow. It's a short little book called Critical Environmental Justice, in which he very unusually from our general discussion of this has chapters about things like criminal justice reform and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he uses those to try to illustrate that environmental justice must also be about more than sort of inequities in terms of toxic risk, which are of course centrally important, but the ways in which, you know, broadly understood our environment and human relationships can be seen in these criminal justice reforms or international conflicts and such. So one of my favorites. And anyone is welcome to jump in. Slow Violence, the Environmentalism of the Poor is also another great one. I have often taught pieces of that in class, I must say.
I'm going to pop over to a syllabus and be able to copy and paste some things. So I'll get right to it.
Oh, good. And a couple of articles on rewilding. And I'm going to lean off screen for 1 second because there is also one more that I want to grab. We had an amazing Zoom session with a woman named Dina Helio-Whitaker, and I'll put it in, but the book is called As Long as Grass Grows, and it's about sort of the her experience, Native American in the West, sort of on indigenous fights for environmental justice from colonization to Standing Rock, it's called. And so she's just really, really also beautifully written and really, really great to use with students. So again, As Long as Grass Grows, and I'll plunk it in there in a minute. We're close. We've got about 10 minutes left. Are there particular additional questions for our panelists, or things the panelists would like to add to their earlier discussions? And open to any of those things that you'd like to do?
So I just see braiding sweetgrass come into the chat as well, which is another great recommendation. And I mentioned this in the presentation, and I cut reading this because there just wasn't enough time, but we read the story of Sky Woman Falling, which is a creation narrative from North America, or Turtle Island. And there's just an excerpt of it that I love and maybe will pique your interest in her writing as well with Braiding Sweetgrass. But it says, moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, and this is about, you know, it's a land of water, and so they need land to survive. And the muskrat gives its life to essentially get a piece of land. And so it says, moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, she sang in thanksgiving and then began to dance, her feet caressing the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks from the dab of mud on the turtle's back until the whole earth was made. Not by Sky Woman alone, but from the alchemy of all the animals' gifts, coupled with her deep gratitude. Together, they formed what we know today as Turtle Island, our home. And I think that that's just a really important thing, especially for those of us who may be based in North America, to have an awareness of those traditional narratives and stories around the creation of this land, and how that spirituality informs our relationship with the environment and the work we do in peace building as well.
Thank you. That's great. I want to, because there are some great recommendations in the chat, I want to remind you all that you can capture those chats by moving the cursor to those three little dots in the chat box, and one of the choices is Save Chat, and so you can capture that as you want. For those of us who all ended up teaching at Zoom University on the drop of a dime in 2020, we have gradually picked up real skills over the time. Are there any other questions? Any other things you want to chime in, or any other final comments from any of the other panelists? All right. Well, I want to say that it's been delightful, very cool stuff going on in the realms of both research and action and engagement. And so I think you did very fine under the title Innovations in Conceptualizing and Undertaking Peacebuilding. I think, in fact, both were accomplished quite successfully. So thank you all very much. Great work, and off to more conferencing. Thanks.